entry icon is where invoices are generated from receipts that have already been posted, unless the invoice was entered directly while receiving items. Invoices entered and posted appear in accounts payable so they can be paid. Enter the invoice number in the invoice number field. To recall a previously posted invoice, enter or select from the Finder. To enter an invoice in purchase orders, the receipt needs to first be posted. Either enter the receipt number in the receipt number field or use the Finder to locate it. Multiple receipts can also be combined onto one invoice using the From Multiple Receipts option, like the multiple purchase orders being combined onto a single receipt discussed in the previous section. The vendor attached to the receipt appears in the vendor number field at the top of the window. To verify the vendor address information or to create a single invoice for multiple posted receipts, enter or select the vendor number before selecting the receipt number. To prevent the invoice from being paid in accounts payable, select the On Hold field. The system defaults to the date Accpac was started for the invoice date. This date, of course, can be any date, past or future. The posting date determines the period that transactions are updated in the general ledger. This date either defaults from the invoice date or the date Accpac was started, depending on the default posting date switch within PO options discussed earlier. The year-end period corresponding to the posting date displays from the fiscal calendar. Accpac then displays the purchase order number associated with the receipt that was entered. If a single receipt was created earlier for multiple purchase orders, the first purchase order selected appears here. The Total Invoice field displays the amount of the invoice as calculated from the receipt. If the invoice amount is different than the posted receipt, enter the correct invoice amount here, and then correct the area that is wrong. It could be a cost change to an item after the receipt was entered, or possibly an additional cost value is different. Let's assume an additional cost is going to be added. So change the invoice total to $1,261.11. If remit to locations were defined for the vendor, enter or select the address to use. To verify that the correct address has been selected for payment, click the Zoom button or blue arrow. Then optionally select or enter the Bill To address where the invoice is sent for payment. The vendor account set appears from the receipt. Although this code can be changed, normally it is not changed, because the account set code references the accounts payable control account, among others, that gets posted in general ledger. However, if this invoice references a different class of items than what the vendor normally purchases, such as non-trade items, for example, change this code so the correct accounts are used. Note that the account set selected is for all items being invoiced and additional costs. If multiple receipts were consolidated on one invoice that identified different account sets, the first receipt selected determines the default account set. Different detail lines cannot go to different accounts. Optionally enter any description or reference information. The lower portion of the window displays the items and field values from the receipt or receipts being invoiced. Enter or accept Yes in the Fully Paid Invoice field if the detail line is to be fully invoiced. If the quantity invoiced equals the quantity received for the detail, Yes is the default. If the quantity invoiced is less than the quantity received, possibly because more items are expected and the posting of the invoice is to wait until all items have been received, change the value to No. If no more items are expected, or if you are invoicing the quantity you have received to date, enter Yes. Accpac displays the item number and description for those items that have been received, and then the location code from the receipt. Accept or enter the quantity to be invoiced. Accpac defaults to the quantity from the receipt. Normally, this is the quantity to be invoiced, but possibly the wrong quantity was entered on the receipt, or more or less items than received are being invoiced. One word of caution here. If the quantity being entered is different than the default, Be sure to enter the quantity using the unit of measure field to the right. This field cannot be changed. Accpac defaults to the cost entered on the receipt for the unit of measure. If the user has the appropriate security rights, the cost can be changed. Be sure to enter the cost correctly associated with the unit of measure. Remember, the total cost of all details must match the invoice total above. If a discount for the item existed on the receipt, the discount entered defaults here. Enter or change the discount percent or amount if necessary. If the tax was factored in the cost of the item on the receipt, the tax amount is displayed next. Optionally change the tax settings by clicking the Item Tax button. Once again, Accpac displays the net of tax extended amount. Factor any taxes. The next field is the weight unit of measure. If weight is assigned to the item in inventory control, Accpac displays the weight unit of measure and the weight of the item. The extended weight is calculated by multiplying the quantity by the unit weight. If a vendor's unique item number existed on the receipt, that item number appears here. Next, the system displays the sales order number entered on the receipt. If no sales order was entered on the receipt, and it is new now, upon entering the invoice that this item satisfies a sales order, enter the sales order number. Although the received item may be needed for multiple sales orders, only one can be entered. If the item on the invoice is new in stock, the expense account field displays the general ledger account from the receipt. In addition, if the item is a non-stock item, the non-stock clearing account entered on the receipt appears. The receipt number field displays the receipt number where the item detail originated. This is useful if more than one receipt is combined on one invoice, using the From Multiple Receipts option. The manufacturer's item number is displayed next if one was entered earlier on a receipt or purchase order. The Optional Fields field is where optional fields specific to this item detail are entered. Optional fields assigned to the invoice as a whole are entered using the Optional Fields page. Optional fields are discussed in the Sage Accpac Optional Fields course. And finally, discountable. This setting indicates if the cost of the item is discountable towards any vendor term discounts. So, if the vendor provides a 2% discount for this item if the invoice is paid within 10 days, and the appropriate term code is used on the Terms page, entering or selecting Yes here indicates that this item qualifies. Although Accpac automatically calculates tax when necessary based on the tax settings established with the vendor, the Item Tax button is used to view or change the item side of the tax settings. As discussed earlier, tax settings should be made if the vendor-item combination for this particular purchase needs to calculate differently from the default settings for this particular purchase. The Item Tax button also allows the Container section of the window to appear as one window, so all the fields can be observed without having to scroll left and right. In the event any tax settings are adjusted for the item while entering the invoice, click the Calculate Taxes button to have the system recalculate the new tax values. The Taxes page displays the tax settings for the vendor's side of the tax calculation process. As discussed earlier, calculating taxes in purchase orders observes two components, whether the specific item is taxable and if the vendor is taxable. Purchase orders refers to the tax matrix and common services discussed in the System Manager course to determine if the item-vendor combination is taxable or not, and if it is, what the tax rate is. The item side of the matrix is determined on the Details tab using the Item Tax button, while the Taxes page determines the vendor side of the tax calculation. The taxes settings shown on this window default from how they were accepted on the receipt. Make changes to the tax settings on this window if this particular invoice requires a tax override. Then click the Calculate Taxes button to recalculate the tax amounts. The Terms page determines any vendor term discounts provided for this invoice. Return discounts default from the vendor profile in accounts payable or from a template if one is used. If the vendor provides a discount, such as 2% off if the invoice is paid within 10 days, the 2% off qualifies for all detail lines on the invoice page, where yes is specified in the discountable field. Although the return code defaults from the vendor or template, the code can be changed for this invoice. Changing the return code only affects this invoice. The return code displays the final due date, a discount date if one applies, and what the discount percent or amount is. A return code percent or amount override can also be directly entered. The additional costs page is where non-specific inventory expenses are entered that the vendor is charging. For example, expenses such as shipping or handling fees that may or may not be factored into the cost of the items being received. Any additional costs entered on a receipt that apply specifically to this vendor appear automatically. Existing details can be changed, and/or new charges can be entered. To enter a new additional cost, within the Container section, click the Insert key. Enter or select the additional cost. Then enter the additional cost amount. When additional costs are added in the Setup section of purchase orders, item taxes are established. These default settings appear for the additional cost being selected. Making changes to how tax is calculated can be done by selecting the Cost Tax button. If any changes are made, click the Calculate Taxes button to update the window. As discussed in the Receipts section of this training, Accpac provides several ways to prorate the additional cost. No proration indicates to directly expense the additional cost to the expense account entered in this field. Prorate by quantity prorates the additional cost amount by the percentage of the quantity of the item against the quantity total for all items being received. Prorate by cost prorates the amount of the additional cost by the cost percentage of an item against the entire cost of all items being received. Prorate by weight prorates the additional cost by the weight of a specific item against the weight of all items being received. And the Prorate Manually option allows allocation amounts to be manually entered for each item. If this is selected, the Distribute Proration field becomes available. Distribute the additional cost amount, shown in the top right corner of the window, to the desired amount. The total allocated amount for all items must match the total additional cost amount. As discussed in the Receipts section, the Reproration field determines what should happen if any of the items on this receipt are returned to the vendor in the future. The Leave option keeps the allocated amount with the item number and distributes it among other existing items, where the Prorate option takes the additional cost amount that was allocated to the item when it was received and distributes it to the other items, if any, that were in the original receipt. The Expense option expenses the allocated additional cost directly to the return account listed here, if an item is returned later from this receipt. You can optionally enter any reference or comments regarding the additional cost, and view the receipt number where the additional cost originated, in the event the invoice was generated from multiple receipts. The Optional Fields field is where optional field values are assigned to the additional cost, on a line-by-line basis. And finally, if the additional cost applies towards any vendor term discounts, as discussed earlier. The Optional Fields page displays any optional fields assigned to the invoice header section. As mentioned earlier, optional fields are discussed in another course. If multi-currency is installed and configured for the database, a Rates page is available. This is where changes can be made to the exchange rate information if the vendor's source currency is different from the company's functional currency. Optionally change the rate type, date associated with the exchange rate, or the actual rate itself. The Totals page displays the Invoice Totals window. Optionally enter an overall comment that prints on the invoice and observe the total weight of the items on the invoice for those items where weight was entered. also observe the invoice subtotal, any entered discounts, the calculated tax amount, and the invoice total. The bottom portion of the window contains another row of buttons that are visible from any page. Click the Post button when the invoice is ready to be posted. As discussed earlier, the History button inquires on previous purchases for item-vendor combinations with the ability to further drill down into the details of a particular document to view its contents. When your invoice is complete, click the Post button to post it. You then have the option to print the invoice immediately or save it to print later.
Let's take a look at return entry.